Okay, ready?
Yes.
All right. Hello. Hi, Brittany.
Hi, Julia.
This is very funny for Brittany and I because, fun fact, our friendship and work co-workership started in Zoom. So we actually exist completely within the four walls of our Zoom screens and have only been in person together like
Three
three
times?
times? 3 times? That sounds
Yeah.
right. 3 times. So you'd think we would be a lot less awkward than we actually probably will be, but because we should be
We
used
feel
to
like
this.
we're just having a conversation with each other.
That is also true. These are all true things. So welcome to our session. We're very excited to be here today with the Educator Collaborative Gathering. We are going to be sharing a lot of our own work together today, but first let's just jump in by introducing who we are. Brittany.
Okay. I'm Brittany Jefferson. I am a fifth grade teacher in Los Angeles, California. And I am also a climate justice advocate, and I advocate for the climate through my lifestyle and education brand, Mom Chronicles.
And my name is Julia Pledl Fernandez, and I'm also a fifth grade teacher in Los Angeles. I teach fifth grade with Brittany. And I'm in my 7th year teaching. And prior to this, to fifth grade, I was a 6th and 7th grade teacher. And I'm also an associate member with the Educator Collaborative. So I'm very excited to finally be participating in one of our gatherings. And I will name, as I already hear some crowing outside of the door, that one of the things that really brought Brittany and I together in our friendship and in our partnership as educators is just the shared experience of being parents during distance learning during a pandemic. So no promises that this will be a quiet presentation. Her husband and my wife are delightfully and patiently and wonderfully occupying our children, but it's highly possible they will interrupt at any given moment. So bear with us. Okay, so now that we introduced ourselves, why don't we go ahead and just get started a little bit with our why, Brittany?
Okay. Let's do it. So I'm going to read a quote from the book, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. We need a whole cultural shift where it becomes our culture to take care of the earth. And in order to make this shift, we need storytelling about how the earth takes care of us and how we can take care of her, by Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who is like my favorite person on the internet right now.
Internet, podcast, where else?
Seriously.
Everywhere.
So we chose this quote because we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of just talking about climate change in general and the fact that it's not really happening enough. And in order for us to really look at how the human impact on Earth, how those things have manifested, we really have to take a look at the history and the stories and that connect us to Earth and the resources. And so we can do that as educators through talking to our students about climate change.
I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for a second. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us just a little bit more about this idea of a cultural shift. So I know that you have a lot of meshing of your multiple identities as a sustainability activist, as a mom, as an educator. So perhaps you could just speak a little bit about your journey to what we're going to share today.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with kind of how I started my journey and really kind of how like Mom Chronicles really came about. So I began Mom Chronicles as a way to discuss the threat of climate change and sustainability tips for the everyday person. As an educator and a mother, I began to realize the importance of teaching children about this topic because they will be facing the harsh effects as our climate becomes more unpredictable and weather events are more severe. And upon exploring my own identities as a Black and Indigenous woman, I began to connect the dots between Indigenous land sovereignty and the role that colonization has played in the way our current society is structured. And so we have to understand really that colonization and racism are the root of the climate crisis. And it's important for everyone to understand this when thinking about how we can create solutions and for people to truly find their place in the movement for a more sustainable world. And when we think about a cultural shift, we really have to think about the decolonization of our mind and our society and how we can move forward. And through doing that, we really do that by a culturally responsive, approach to teaching and understanding the climate crisis and its origins.
Okay, so when we all sat down at the beginning of this past school year and started really thinking about planning for a fifth grade year, so shout out to Nusha and Shannon, the rest of our team, we already had a climate change unit that we'd worked with before. It had been developed by fifth grade teachers before us, and we had refined it last year. And I looked at it as like a really robust unit, right? Because like the focus was kiddos to walk away, like feeling really confident talking about what climate change is, the difference between global warming and climate change, really understanding greenhouse gases, when it culminated in an argumentative postcard campaign, right? And trying to ignite and inspire the community towards change. And you brought with you this lens of understanding that in order to really have a robust unit or learning on climate change, we had to look at it from a more multidimensional approach. So consider how we're teaching our students and how we're offering them multiple opportunities for engaging in climate change. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about this idea of a multidimensional approach. What do you mean by that?
Definitely. So I think about how we all live at an intersection of multiple identities, and our identities can impact the types of experiences that we have in the world. So understanding one's positionality and the ways that we can both be marginalized and hold privilege can enlighten us to act in a way that creates a society that is more inclusive. So we explores the ways in which identity and intersectional social justice and climate change are interconnected in our classrooms. So the goal is for students to understand the role of colonialism and racism that have played in our current climate crisis, and for students to take action in a way that makes space for people with marginalized identities. And when we talk about intersection or in the intersectionality of people and the intersection of multiple identities, I do want to note that that is a phrase that originated from Kimberly Crenshaw. And we kind of take that like thought of intersectionality and the multiple layers of people's identity and where that kind of positions us in how we are viewed by society and the space that we are often given.
What is the reasoning for centering voices of marginalized communities, for really bringing that to the front of this learning? Why does that have to go hand in hand with understanding climate change?
Because like what we want students to walk away with understanding is that there isn't one way to be. There isn't only one way to exist in the world. And unfortunately, colonialism and white supremacy have built values and norms of our society that have caused a lot of destruction and have also taken a lot of identities, values, and traditions that other cultures uplift and value and have push them to the side. So by understanding the true history of climate change and by centering those voices who have been silenced, ignored, or like forced to assimilate for so long, we can look to them to really guide our path forward. And if we don't really confront this history, then we run the risk of repeating those same colonized values and really just repeating the same problems over and over. So kind of like we mentioned before, in order to really address climate change, we have to create a more just society. And we begin building a more just society, as educators by educating our students multiple perspectives and multiple voices of concepts.
So what I hear you saying is essentially that in order to fix this moment, in order to move forward, right, in order to actually have solutions for the climate crisis, we have to first understand how we got here in this moment, because we have to do this differently. If we continued forward in a way that uplifts white supremacy, that uplifts colonization, we're never going to get to where we need to be in order to make that cultural shift we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly.
Okay. So with that kind of understanding of our why today, I want to sort of head us over to a little bit more of where we get started with this. So let's do that. So just like with our anything we're teaching in our classroom, whether it's math content or science standards or our writing instruction, we have to feel very comfortable with the content that we teach, right? And the same goes for when we are teaching our students about climate change. So before we jump into like a quick mini lesson with Brittany about really what is climate change and what is climate justice, so that we all have a really solid understanding just for the purposes of today, I just want to invite you to grab a quick pen and some paper and just jot down the answers to a couple of questions. And I'm just going to read them out to you, and you'll probably see where we're going with this. But the first question is just, when was the first time that you learned about climate change? What is climate change? What's the cause of climate change? How often did you think about climate change in your teenage years? How often did you think about it in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s? How often do you think about it now?
And it's possible that if you're like a lot of folks and the first time that you really thought about climate change was after you watched An Inconvenient Truth or shortly after, the reality is that most adults walking around have a very surface level understanding of the topic. And while we don't want to spend all of today learning about climate change itself, we do want to make sure that we're all operating under the same common understandings. So when you're thinking about climate change and its origins, how did it truly begin? And understanding the colonial origins versus the Industrial Revolution origins. When you think about the Industrial Revolution, we kind of think of, well, climate change started because, humans were progressing too quickly, and like the burning of fossil fuels kind of being like the sole purpose and the sole, reason why climate change is happening. But understanding colonialism as the origin also understands that by creating a society that looks as natural resources as a commodity and exploits people for a maximization of profits, then we are then creating this whole multi-layered society where there are people who are working very hard but are barely able to support themselves, and then have faced the brunt of climate disaster upon like a cushion that people who have more wealth and more luxury are able to kind of pad themselves against. We also have to understand carbon emissions and fossil fuel. Fossil fuel extraction and processing and burning for our use and then emitting into the atmosphere are very integral parts of the climate crisis. And so we do have to kind of understand the processes and the science behind how this is happening and why it's so detrimental to our existence, essentially. And then understanding how climate change disproportionately affects different groups of people. That climate change is only a future problem for white people. It's really a right now problem for people who belong to the global majority. People are dying and are being affected by storms and pollution and working conditions that are not satisfactory right now. And so we really have an obligation, especially as Americans in a country that presents itself with a lot of privilege. We have a responsibility to kind of do more and find our place in a way to help mitigate the crisis. And when white Europeans decided to colonize the world and extort resources and people for profit, it created this imbalance and affected the Earth's ability to create and sustain resources. And if we, as using humans, to commodify these resources, the imbalance kind of continues. So essentially, it's not okay to exploit people and resources and think that we can continue to do that and then think that we can somehow address the climate crisis without addressing those aspects of our society. And when we're thinking about addressing climate justice and what climate justice is, it really is creating a livable future for all humans and all living things. And that means a more just society. That means addressing the gender wage gap. That means addressing labor unions and workers' rights. That means addressing farmers' rights and things like that. One in which one group doesn't hold or maintain the power. It's really important for us to acknowledge the importance of power sharing and the power of collective voices and movements and creating space for marginalization. And then the last thing that we really need to know is we really need to be familiar with our science standards and our social studies standards.
Thank you for sort of helping us feel confident in what we're going to explore with the rest of today. So before we jump into what is the kind of core of our session today, I kind of want to just revoice what Brittany just talked about, because it really is what we mean when we say that we are teaching our history to save our future, right? The goal is to really understand the colonialism roots of the climate crisis. And so you're going to see that today in all of the work that we are going to be sharing. And when we think about what this looks like in our classroom, we're going to be sharing with you work that we have done with our students in a digital learning setting. You'll see some charts and things from our classroom from years prior, mainly just because there's only so many Jamboards a person can look at. So we're just trying to create a little visual variety. And we are trying to sort of organize our thinking today into two big categories for us to discuss. One is the community. So what is the classroom community that we need to create in order for this learning to take place? And then what is the content? What is the actual teaching? What is it that students are learning? And sort of in those spaces, you'll see us engage in talking about where this is all happening. So the different subject areas this teaching and learning is happening. Because again, as we already talked about in the beginning, this isn't just relegated to science learning, as well as how students are engaging in the topic. So we're going to get started first by talking about community. So how do we create a classroom environment for this learning? When we talk about this, we have a couple of goals in mind. The first goal is that we want to co-construct a classroom community with shared values and clear agreements. So this is this opportunity to engage with our students on an exploration of personal values and then consider what values we hold as an actual community, right? So oftentimes in this learning, we're exploring mission statements and founding documents and considering the different ways that groups of people with a shared purpose find their values and then create agreements to uphold those values, right? So this a huge part of it is not just to identify what are our shared values, but also what do we agree to do to protect those values? And what do we agree to do when we go against those values? This is also an important time to learn explicit vocabulary that will allow our students to discuss topics connected to identity, power, and systems of oppression, right? It's kind of like a simple idea for teaching complex topics, which is that you got to know the words if you're going to have conversations around certain topics. So this is something that we tuck into our learning throughout the year, but in the beginning of the year, we really focused on making sure students knew the right words to talk about all types of social identities, as well as language needed to discuss race, racism, and certain systems of oppression going into the rest of our learning. And then we have a phrase in our grade level, which is that you got to be able to point to it, right? So whenever we're talking about what we want to do with our students, we ask each other like, okay, well, where can you point to it? And this is just an idea of making sure that if we're saying that our classroom is a safe place, we have to be able to point to where it is that we created that safety. If we're saying our classroom is inclusive, we got to be able to point to where we created an inclusive space. A resource that we love for that is Not Light by Fire: How to Lead Meaningful Race Conversations in the Classroom by Matthew R.K. If you are interested in exploring some really practical strategies for how to create a safe space, this is an incredible resource. He talks about demystifying the safe space, right? And really getting rid of this idea that a space just becomes safe because a teacher waves a wand, and instead really unpacking the need for teachers to do active steps in creating a community with their students in which folks feel safe and can also be brave learners. Super important resource to explore too for white educators who are considering engaging in conversations of race with their students. He talks a lot about a concept of his called house talk. And it's a really important idea to consider that just because we as a white educator is ready to teach our students about race or racism, that does not mean that our students are necessarily ready to have that conversation with us, that we have to do the work of building relationships first. So highly recommend that resource. And then the last goal, I did say I wasn't going to go on too much of a ramp about that one because I could talk about that book forever. The next goal is we have to get lots of practice, right? Students need to have a ton of opportunities to approximate the learning that goes with creating a classroom environment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But first, Brittany's going to walk us through a possible lesson that we could do when it comes to crafting agreements and deciding on community values. So whenever you are ready, Brittany.
Okay. So when we are creating classroom values and agreements, we first want to kind of define what values and agreements really are for students and make sure that they grasp what they are and what they mean, and even providing some examples on what it can mean to uphold a value in class. And when we think about this, we also want to think about power and how we can share power with our students in this moment and really empower them to create a space where they feel safe. We really want to kind of stay away from creating rules and agreements and values that are teacher centered. They only come from our teacher brain and our teacher heart, in hopes that our students will comply so that we can mold them into the humans that we want them to be. What it really is we want to empower students to have a voice in a community where they have participated in, so they can mold themselves into the humans that they want to be, and we can facilitate that. So I got a lot of my guidance and structure really on how I did this with my class by participating in this workshop with Trisha Mokino, Britt Hawthorne, and Tiffany Jewell called Co-Creating Classroom Community. It was a great 3-session workshop where we really kind of worked through what it means to, kind of power share, and the difference between, empowering our students and wanting our students just to comply with our wishes. And then also, some strategies on how we can actually implement in our real world classrooms, the systems and the rules that we have school wide that we can't really avoid, while also, creating a space that is unique for our own individual classroom setting. So up top here on these colorful squares, love, self-esteem, community and collaboration, chances, respect, friendship. These are the values that my class came up with. And the way that I had them do that was after, kind of defining to them what a value is. Every student got multiple opportunities to share a word or a value that they felt would help them feel safe and brave in our classroom space. And so we kind of gave every student an opportunity to share and tallied them up. And then we grouped some of the words that were similar and kind of had them in various categories, and came up with language that, could encompass some of those things. And this is what we came up with. We also had thoughts on how we can demonstrate those things in our classrooms. So having a conversation with others, and being willing to compromise when someone has caused harm, be understanding and uplift each other even after making mistakes. When I look at our value of chances, we really kind of talk about, giving each other grace and what it means for people to make mistakes and still need compassion after they've done something harmful, in order to be able to, understand their perspective and then be able to move forward. And that kind of led us into a conversation about accountability. What is helpful accountability? What is not helpful accountability? I also refer to, I think back of restorative justice practices as well. And thinking about, if we take action, if we do something that causes harm to someone, what are ways that will help us be able to move forward versus just ways that make us feel anger or embarrassment or shame for doing something wrong.
And here we just have some more examples of some of this exploration on values in practice. And speaking of practice, right, when we're talking about this idea of giving students opportunities to practice this goal, this can take a lot of shapes. And honestly, it takes a lot of shapes and forms depending on the type of learning that we're doing, right? So one idea that I've used for the past couple of years in my classroom is just to establish some norms around different topics, right? So when it comes to anything related to identity, co-creating with our students norms for how we engage in those conversations, and then continue to practice and uphold those throughout any conversation on a topic connected to identity. Similarly, when we engage in conversations around climate change, as we know, these can be kind of frightening conversations to engage in for both adults and students. And so coming up with norms and strategies as a class for how to support each other and certain things that we will agree to do in those spaces around those topics. And these are things that we create depending on the unit and continue to carry through and refer back to both in the classroom and also in a digital setting. So obviously, when we're talking about creating community, a lot of this stuff is getting done in the first 6 weeks of school, or, first 10, 12 weeks of school. But it should also be happening in multiple areas throughout the day, right? So it doesn't just have to be for time dedicated to community building. It could be happening in read alouds. We found a lot of benefit in tucking some of this work into celebrations of Heritage Month this year, current events, social studies, morning meetings, and in literacy. We're weaving these kind of core big ideas of values, agreements, and identity into almost everything that we're doing. So one example of what that might look like when it comes to exploring identity is using specific read alouds to help us tuck in essential questions around identity, reflecting on our own personal identity. Again, we've used this book as Anti-Racist a lot this year. And everywhere along the way, sort of touching base on a running definition that students have, as well as running questions that students have about identity. The essential questions that we use to really think about this are ones that we refer back to constantly, like no matter what it is that we're reading or exploring in both fiction and nonfiction as well. And then in our literacy, one thing that we did this year, and this is a unit, I call it Unit 0, that I developed with a former grade level partner, shout out to Sarah Shift in 6th grade. And this Unit 0 is really an opportunity to begin launching a readers and writers workshop and centering all of the actual strategy work around reflecting on our personal identity. So in our writing space, students are becoming experts on the subject of themselves, and then oftentimes culminating their thinking in either a personal narrative or an I am from poem. And then in the reader space, students are really engaging in reflecting on not only who they are as a reader, but also how their personal identity and social identities impact the way they understand the story, right? This year, we read one of my favorite read alouds with our students, which is Towers Falling, which presents a really cool opportunity to have students engaging in some learning about social units alongside the main character of Deja. So highly recommend that, especially for 5th grade classes. Our students just completely fell in love with that book by Jewel Parker Rhodes. Okay, and so with that, we're now going to launch into the second chunk of this, which is really to consider what content we need to think about when we are teaching. What is it we're actually teaching? So I'm going to hand it over to Brittany.
I was muted, sorry. Here we go. So now, so as we said earlier, we really see the goal is for students to have a deep, complex understanding of the topics that we are exploring. So for that reason, we are integrating learning activities in every subject. But for the purposes of today, we're just going to kind of go through and look through the content areas of social studies, science, and literacy. So in social studies, we have covered the general topics of Indigenous culture, value traditions, power dynamics, and colonization. And then our trimester 3 goal is to really be centered on disruption. So specifically with Indigenous culture and values, by digging deeply into Indigenous culture, values, traditions, history, storytelling, and modern day existence, we bring understanding to students that people existed on this earth pre-colonization, and not everyone has those same values. So the Indigenous connection to earth is very different from the colonial one. And so in order for us to really reestablish our own place in nature, we must understand the role Indigenous people all over the world play in creating a more sustainable future. With power and power dynamics, we really guided students through thinking, reading, listening, and reflecting on topics of power. So who has it? How can it be used, misused, etc., and really apply this learning to the context of life in colonial America. And we will kind of continue to revisit questions about power and what power is as we go through our disruption unit and really start learning about power sharing, really learn about people power and collective action. In colonization, the colonization of the world is, has had drastic impacts on the natural world and the people who inhabit it. So to really understand that impact, we must explore the experiences of the oppressed people during the colonization of North America and connect it to the foundation of the United States. It's a really complicated, difficult, harsh history for us to kind of confront and acknowledge, but we have to do so. We use the social studies standards to kind of guide our questioning and our pacing of the US history topics. And then we integrate primary sources and passages that center the perspectives of everyone involved and not just those of the colonists, settlers, white Europeans, essentially. And for disruption, this section is really going to be focused on how we disrupt cycles. So really understanding cycles that exist really in the natural world and things like that, and how colonization and kind of, the progression of human society, how that kind of disrupted that. Climate change as a disruption of, the natural balance of Earth and its systems. Also the disruption of like the human connection with Earth and humans as stewards of the Earth.
And I think I got a little out of order, so I'm actually going to take you back to this slide if you wanted to talk at all a little bit about the topics.
Yes. So these are some general potential topics that you can discuss that really span across grade levels. So, for science, there's photosynthesis, the water cycle, Earth systems, ecosystems, types of energy, plants and animals, the life cycles of butterflies, pollinators, climate, weather. Most science topics can be related to climate change in some way because climate change is a very large issue, but it has weaved its way and infiltrated every aspect of the natural world. And that falls into, lots of realms of science. And it also includes, chemistry and things like that. In social studies, really talking about Indigenous tribal nations and what their life and experience and, their societies, how they were, created, built, the richness of their culture. Discussing colonial America, discussing racism and prejudice and bias, government, politics, economy, communities. There's so many things in so many ways that, our existence really, kind of falls under this umbrella. And there's so many ways that we can move change forward and that we can progress in, our sustainable future that we're all trying to create and build. And, we all kind of have our place in that. And these topics really can be woven into anything that we are teaching. And then when we think about ELA and, our social emotional learning, or we can talk about identity, fairness, respect, community, the very basic of like humans' existence, right? Like, and how we want to connect with others, how we want to take our actions and take our values and really mesh those together. Power and understanding how our power, who has it, and how we can redistribute it so that those who don't have as much are also able to, make a positive imprint on the world.
Okay. So when we're going to just go into sharing a couple of opportunities that we have taken this year for tackling those big concepts of colonization, disruption, power, and Indigenous culture and values. So we did a unit sort of integrated in both our literacy and our inquiry spaces on origin stories, right? So we really entered in with this sort of essential question of why do we tell stories? And in that process of engaging with learning about all sorts of different origin stories from multiple cultures, students were also exploring their origin stories. So really unpacking who they are, who their family is, their heritage, their culture, as well as understanding their land, right? The land that we stand on, whose land it was, the role that it plays in our identity or the role that it doesn't, right? And beginning to sort of bring an understanding for the land and the people who lived here before us. So it's a great opportunity for us to also tuck in some of that vocabulary work that we talked about at the beginning. And then it also culminates with students crafting their own origin stories at the end of this unit. And it's a really great entryway for us to introduce Columbus and the first colonization of America as we consider the origin story of America that most students are told, as we really start to think about the reason why certain stories are told from a certain perspective as well. We also did some learning just around Indigenous people as the first environmentalists, right? And there's lots of ways to sort of enter into this work depending on your grade level. Some great picture books to explore. For our purposes, we introduced students to the Haudenosaunee people and this principle of the seventh generation principle. And so students did some quote analysis, watched some videos, and really reflected on what sustainability is from the perspective of Indigenous people, as opposed to from the perspective of modern day colonized thinking, right? So sustainability not necessarily just being, and Brittany, I'm going to shout out her at Teacher Mom Chronicles later, but she talks a lot about this on her page, just that sustainability doesn't have to be something that is just in the hands of wealthy white folks, right? Sustainability is actually a core value of Indigenous people, and it's something that we can look to as a way to move forward, right? And then additionally, we wanted to share just one more kind of consideration for how we can reflect on Indigenous culture and values. Once again, you see that this book is anti-racist was a huge part of our work this year, and really allowed us to unpack the difference between colonization and colonialism and reflect on the impact of not just Native American culture, but also our culture as well, as a society of diverse folks in a classroom, right? So we were able to sort of as an entryway, reflect on how it is colonization has also impacted us here in fifth grade on Zoom every day, right? Also, some just like timely moments for additional exploration were Indigenous Peoples Day as an opportunity to look at some youth activists who are really living their core values as they fight for our earth every day, and really a great moment for sort of starting to tuck into some of the solution oriented thinking that we'll talk about a little bit later on, but sort of offering some pathways for students to consider their own role in activism for impacting change.
So the next big concept that we really talked about was power and power dynamics and how it kind of shows up in our lives. So here are some of the discussion questions that we pose to our students to think on ways to think about power, and also exploring the power book, which we will share in a moment. So what is power? Who or what has power in our lives? What are ways people use their power for positive change? What are ways that people, groups, or institutions can abuse their power? And then reflect on our 13 colonies learning and who had the power and how did they use it. So the power book here is really great kid-friendly language on what power is, the different forms that it can take, different people who have exercised their power. what it really means to, exert your power over people or use your power for influence and things like that. And so, here's just some of the jam boards that we have our students create, centered around power and like reflecting on their thinking about the different groups of people who lived in the original 13 colonies, and how those different perspectives and those different experiences kind of influenced the amount of power that they had and the type of experiences that they had due to the level of power that was unequally spread around. And then our next big topic that we discussed is colonial America from marginalized perspectives. And so when thinking about colonization and thinking about how we normally teach the 13 colonies, it's usually from the perspective of the colonists, the settlers, in a way where they came here and it was difficult, and then the indigenous people helped them, and then we wiped them out, like in a sentence. But then we focus mainly on like the imports, the exports, the differences in religion, and we really focus on the culture and the life experiences of this one particular group of people, which usually in kind of only covers white landowners and what their experience was like. So we take some time to really dig deep into alternative perspectives. So the perspective of colonial women, indigenous people, and enslaved Africans. We use primary sources and passages that kind of center these voices in order for students to really, get a glimpse into a varied experience. And after, asking students these, different questions, have them do quote analysis using the word, phrase, sentence protocol. We then have students kind of reflect on what they've learned and the things that stood out to them. And so during this reflection, they reflect on how what they learned and what they read about really applies to the questions of why people leave their homes. Was life in the colonies the same for everyone? Why is it important to understand these events from the perspectives of all people involved? And having these conversations and really having these questions and guiding these questions really helps students with not only just thinking about history and thinking about history from multiple perspectives, but those are ELA standards. Those are literacy skills. We have analyzing perspective and voice, and how point of view and a person's experience may shape that point of view. And it makes me think too of like the lesson progression of our Common Core ELA standards, where in 5th grade, point of view isn't only about identifying who is telling the story and how do they feel and things like that. It's really taking a look at the identity of the person that is telling the story and how their experiences within that identity shape the way the story is being told. And so that's why it's important to, look at one event or look at one period of time from all of the people who participated in said event, because they didn't all have the same experience, and we have to validate all of those experiences equally. And so looking at science and talking about, potential discussion questions, I really kind of want to focus on ecosystems because it's a very broad, like natural sense. And that's how we can really kind of connect nature, and we can connect indigenous tribal nations and their values and how they view nature into what we already have to kind of teach students about nature. So here, just some kind of questions that really you can start asking kids from primary grades and up on: how are humans and nature connected? Where do we see nature in our everyday lives? Are humans a part of nature? What do blank eat? What eats blank? What do plants and animals need to survive? How do Native people respect and protect nature? So really kind of incorporating those connections and helping students kind of unlearn and relearn some of those things about how humans connect with nature and our role as people. We don't have to only solely have the role of destroying nature while we exist here. We can choose something different. And then, some questions that kind of build upon that and really, dig a little deeper and kind of explore more, complexity. So these questions are kind of for middle grade and up is, what is an ecosystem and how is it like a community? How do values and traditions of tribal nations honor nature? What do threats to nature, or how do threats to nature impact indigenous communities? And understanding that like threats to nature may seem like over there problems for us, people who live in metropolitan areas, people who live in suburbs, but for indigenous communities, threats to nature is a direct impact to their livelihood because they are still very much tied to nature and still very much take their values and roles as stewards of nature and defenders of nature and the resources seriously. And so how, deforestation or agriculture or erosion or things might affect us are affecting them more directly and differently. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah. And then here are some gateway science topics that really are climate change, recycling, like sustainability focused, that are some gateway ways for us to kind of start incorporating the language of climate change and incorporating, the language of, the structures that we have to really put in place in our society that need to become the norm, right? So we've got recycling, composting, renewable energy, carbon emissions, fossil fuels, oil spills, understanding those impacts on ecosystems, deforestation, erosion. Those are all things that, we can talk about kind of in isolation that really can open up that gateway to talk about climate change. And then there's also green holidays. Literally every month, there's some type of nature-based holiday that, is on our calendar that we can use to introduce kids to different topics of, of interest within nature. So we've got Earth Day, Arbor Day, World Turtle Day, World Migratory Bird Day. There's so many different things that, can spark various interests in students that can get them really thinking about where their place is in the world and how they can find a place in this, sustainable future and how they can be a part of the solution moving forward. And this slide we created just to kind of devote to some of the resources, or many of the resources actually, that we use in planning all of our content around, these three subject areas that we previously mentioned. I will preface by saying we are not reading these books in isolation from start to finish. What we're doing is we are kind of reading them all simultaneously a little bit and picking and choosing the pieces that apply as we go through the standards, as we go through the discussion questions that we want to cover and the concepts and topics and things that we want our students to walk away with, and how our standards kind of guide that progression. And then we pick from these resources as it pertains to that particular subject or topic and how they, apply to what the overall thing that we're trying to cover. So we've got, a young people's history of the United States. We've got the Power Book. We Are Water Protectors. And honestly, any book that, is written by an Indigenous person that talks about their relationship with nature truly is, valuable in understanding the richness of Indigenous culture, and then also, putting us in a position to learn directly from them.
And before we go on to kind of our last wrapping up moment, I want to call back to something you just said about not reading these texts from start to finish, right? Or not going all the way through in a linear way. So much of the work of planning for this year has been that exact conversation, right? Really fighting this need to first off, do everything perfectly, do everything in compartmentalized chunks, right? To think about history in terms of a timeline, right? And as we started pulling resources for today, we really noticed just how interwoven everything has been, right? It was hard to think about the containers for thoughts. And when we are considering these big concepts, right, these ideas of power, of understanding colonization, of understanding identity, all of these big things we want students to really grapple with and develop a very deep understanding for, that means that we're not always looking at things from a linear perspective, right? We're dipping in and out of history, we're dipping in and out of science content in the name of really offering our students many at-bats, right, for understanding and engaging in the content. Is there anything else? You talk about that in a much more beautiful way than I do. Is there anything else you want to say in terms of that interconnectedness?
First of all, that is absolutely not true, because throughout this entire process, we have both equally have said some pretty genius things. So I'm just going to put that out there right now. But no, I think you hit the nail on the head there. We're really, everything truly is interconnected. And when we think about climate change and like it's a global problem that affects every single person. And so if you think about like from that like macro level and just think about how everything is infiltrated, it really is connected. And so understanding how people identify and how people move through the world and how those experiences affect how they see the world, and then being able to see that like the way I experience the world and the way I move through the world and the way that I have been taught is the right way to move through the world is not necessarily true. There are other ways of being, existing, moving through the world that contributes positively to our culture, to our society. And so we have to be able to embrace all of those things. And so when we think about anti-bias, anti-racist, when we think about cultural responsive teaching, when we think about social justice education and all of those things, and then we're thinking about as teachers preparing our students to solve the world's problems, this is where all of this kind of comes in, you know, like climate change is the problem, and all of the other things that are, you know, and it's the problem that has really manifested from the same root issue, which is, you know, colonization, racism, white supremacy, those, you know, those systems of oppression that we have kind of uplifted for so long that, you know, have caused so many people who have existed and walked through the world differently to then have those experiences be, and that expertise, that wisdom, that culture, you know, kind of be diminished. And so by making sure that we are making space for everyone and the contributions that everyone has contributed to society and human existence in general, and by uplifting all of those voices and kind of using climate change as like the catalyst for how we do that, then that's how we're, you know, bridging those two gaps, is, you know, those two worlds of true diversity, inclusion, and like justice, and then preparing our learners to go out into the world and then make it better.
Which is something, you know, I mean, listening to you talk about that, I really do think about how if we were to talk to perhaps outsiders like Gen Pop about what we are doing in our classroom, you could assume that if we're talking about climate change constantly, that we're talking about it's heavy constantly, right?
Right.
But you talking about this idea of like the culture and the values and the beauty and the joy really being diminished by colonization, right? Being pushed back by white supremacy has really opened up this space in our curriculum for just centering different ways of knowing, centering different experiences, the richness, right? The things that have been so purposely left out of curriculum for so long, right? And so it doesn't feel heavy at all. Like there's certainly parts of it that are difficult and the conversations are hard to navigate, and we're working with our students to do that. But so much of this work is just whose story are we centering in our classroom?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Like we should be like real talk and just tell the folks watching us that we really weren't sure how to end this today.
Right.
Right? We did. We struggled with it. We put all this effort on spring break, mind you, like we're officially on spring break, to create this work today. And we really couldn't think about, we really couldn't get to how to end it, which is a good sign that we could just keep going forever and ever. Yeah. So apologies if this is not the smoothest transition towards our ending here. But we did just want to offer an opportunity to stay in touch. You can tweet along with us today, as we talked about before, with the EdCap Collab Gathering. You can find Brittany on Instagram at Teacher Mom Chronicles, and she also has links there to navigate to her Patreon if you want to get some of the actual resources that we used in our classroom. You can find me at Twitter at Julia Pledl, and Oh, also, if you are watching this live the day of the gathering, Brittany is going to be on her Instagram page sharing some of her favorite accounts that she goes to for education, as well as some of like the actual links for the resources that we use today. So definitely head over there today and find her to get some of that really specific learning. And then Brittany, could you just give a little bit of plug for what you're doing for Earth Day? That would be amazing.
Yes. So I have teamed up with a group of wonderful educators and mothers and scientists and sustainability advocates and all of the hyphens and multiple titles you can think of when it comes to sustainability and STEM. And we came together and we are doing a virtual Earth Day Summit. Tickets are a donation basis. And all of our proceeds are going to Backyard Base Camp, which is a Black woman-owned organization that is working to get people in the Baltimore area outdoors. And it's great. We've got a few days of virtual workshops packed with a lot of different topics and activities around renewable energy, composting, sustainability. And I will be hosting a panel on intersectional environmentalism. And so we'll just be talking really specifically about the disproportionate effects of climate change on Black Indigenous populations. And also, kind of having the people do what I do with my students a little bit, which is like exploring their identities and who they are and where they fall and finding their place in the environmental movement.
And I will most likely be fangirling it up and on Instagram and Twitter that day. So feel free to join us live. So thank you. With that, thank you so much for joining us today. This was our first gathering, and it was our first time talking in a public forum about some of the work that has been very near and dear to our hearts this year.
Yeah, to say the least.
To say the least. To say the least. So I will end on our actual faces instead of on the slide. So thank you so much, and thank you, Brittany. Yay!
Yay!